She had learned to recognize the sound of a wagon slowing near her gate at night, and every single time, by the time she reached the window, whoever it was had already gone, leaving only a stack of firewood and a sack of flour behind, and no name, and no note, and 3 winters' worth of unanswered questions about who in Cedar Fork still thought of her at all. Cedar Fork sat where the river bent hard around a stand of old cedars, a town that measured its winters by how many families made it through without losing someone. Eleanor Ashford had lost her husband 3 years back, in a cattle drive gone wrong, and the town had responded the way small towns often do with a grief they don't know how to carry, with careful distance, polite nods, and casseroles that stopped coming after the first month. She raised her children alone on land that was slowly getting away from her, and told herself, most days, that she needed nothing from anyone. Nathaniel Reeves had buried his own wife 4 years before Eleanor buried her husband, and he had learned, in his own quiet way, that grief shared in silence was still a kind of company. He began leaving firewood at her gate the first winter after her husband died, and told no one, not even himself, exactly why he kept doing it. Neither of them expected the wood pile to become the beginning of anything. But some kindnesses, offered quietly enough and long enough, have a way of becoming impossible to ignore. The cold came down hard over Cedar Fork that January, the kind of cold that settled into the joints of old houses and made every board complain when the wind pushed against it. And Eleanor Ashford lay awake most nights listening to her own roof creak and doing sums in her head that never came out even. She had 2 children asleep in the next room, a woodpile that had looked dangerously thin a week ago and now, mysteriously, did not, and a husband 3 years dead whose absence she still felt most sharply not in the big moments, but in small ones. Reaching for a second coffee cup out of habit, hearing a wagon on the road and turning before she remembered there was no reason to. Mary, sing 9 now and sharp as a tack, still asked sometimes why other families had fathers who came to the schoolhouse recitals, and theirs didn't. Sam, younger, asked less, but Eleanor had caught him more than once standing at the fence line watching the Reeves cattle graze on the neighboring section, small and still, in a way that made her chest ache with a grief she'd stopped letting herself examine too closely. She rose before dawn, same as always, to find the woodpile stacked neat against the shed wall, more than she remembered having the evening before, and a sack of flour set beside it that she hadn't ordered from the mill. It had been happening now for 2 winters. She'd tried once, the first time she noticed it, to stay awake and catch whoever was doing it, sitting by the window with a shawl around her shoulders until her eyes grew too heavy to hold open. She'd woken at dawn to find the wood already there and herself furious at having missed it, furious in a way that surprised her, because underneath the fury was something else she didn't much want to name, a kind of aching gratitude that had nowhere to go, since she didn't know who to thank. She had her suspicions. Cedar Fork wasn't a large town, and there weren't many families with wood to spare and reason to spare it on a widow. They mostly kept at arm's length otherwise. But suspicion wasn't proof, and pride kept her from asking outright, because asking meant admitting she needed it. And admitting she needed it meant confirming what half the town already believed about her, that she couldn't manage the homestead alone, that she ought to sell up and move somewhere her children could be properly looked after by people better equipped for the job. She would not give them that satisfaction. She had told herself so every day for 3 years, through every skipped meal, so the children could eat full ones, through every letter to her late husband's family that went unanswered, through every Sunday at church where the ladies of the Aid Society nodded politely and asked after her health, and never once asked if she needed anything at all. She carried the wood inside herself that morning, armload by armload, her breath fogging in the cold, and did not let herself look toward the Reeves ranch fence line, half a mile off across the frosted pasture, where smoke was already rising steady and gray from a chimney belonging to a man she'd exchanged perhaps 20 words with in 3 long years. She told herself it didn't matter who it was. She told herself a great many things that winter that weren't entirely true. Nate Reeves had a rule about the firewood. a rule he'd made for himself the very first winter and had never once broken. He only went at night, after the Ashford windows had gone dark, and he never once let himself linger long enough to be seen. It had started almost by accident. He'd been hauling a load of cut cedar back from the river stand that first November after Eleanor's husband died, passing near the Ashford place on the county road, and something about the thin gray smoke rising from her chimney, barely enough to call a fire, had caught at something old and tender in his chest. He knew what that particular thinness of smoke meant. He'd rationed his own wood that first winter after burying his wife, too proud to ask the neighbors for help, too raw with grief to explain why he didn't have the heart to swing an axe some mornings. Nobody had left wood at his gate. He'd gotten through that winter cold and stubborn and mostly alone, and he had never forgotten what it felt like. So he'd turned his wagon that November evening, quiet as he could manage, and left half his load stacked against her shed wall, and told himself it was a one-time thing, a neighborly kindness that didn't require a name attached. It had not stayed a one-time thing. Gus Ferris, his one full-time hand, an old cowpuncher with more opinions than teeth left in his head, had figured it out sometime during the second winter, catching Nate loading extra wood onto the wagon on a night when there was no earthly reason for a delivery run. "You're sweet on the widow Ashford," Gus had said, plain as anything, and Nate had nearly dropped the log he was holding. "I am not," he'd said. "She's got children to feed and a homestead too big for one woman to manage the wood for. That's the whole of it." Gus had grinned around his pipe stem in a way that suggested he believed exactly none of that. But he hadn't pressed the matter, and Nate had been grateful for his silence ever since, because Nate himself wasn't entirely sure the explanation held up under close inspection. He didn't examine it too closely. He'd learned, since his wife's death, that some things were easier managed by not looking at them straight on. He'd loved Catherine fiercely and lost her suddenly. A fever that took her in 4 days flat during a summer he still couldn't think about without his chest going tight. And the last thing he'd said to her, 2 mornings before she died, had been sharp and impatient over some small household matter he could no longer even remember the substance of. He had never gotten the chance to take it back. He had carried that unfinished sentence for 4 years now, the way some men carried old injuries, mostly quiet, until the weather changed and it ached all over again. So he left wood at a widow's gate in the dark and told himself it was only decency, and rode home each time with something in his chest that felt suspiciously like the beginning of hope, though he wasn't yet ready to call it that. That January night, hauling the wagon back from the Ashford place under a sky thick with stars, he found himself slowing near the fence line longer than the errand required, looking back once toward the small dark house with its single lit window, and wondered, not for the first time, what Eleanor Ashford's voice sounded like when she wasn't guarding every word of it. He shook the thought loose before it could settle, snapped the reins, and rode on toward home through the cold, clear dark, telling himself, as he had 100 times before, that this was simply neighborly kindness and nothing more. He was getting worse, he knew, at believing himself. The Ladies' Aid Society met the first Tuesday of every month in the church basement, and Constance Whitfield had run it with an iron hand for 11 years, ever since her husband's mercantile money had made her, by unspoken agreement, the closest thing Cedar Fork had to town royalty. The widow Ashford came up in conversation the way she always did, in the careful, sympathetic tones the society reserved for topics they'd long since stopped meaning to act on. "Someone really ought to check on her," said Mrs. Pruitt, threading a needle for the quilt they were piecing. "Poor thing, out there alone with those children, no husband to see to the heavy work." "We send a casserole in the fall," Constance said, as though that settled the matter entirely. "That was in October," Mrs. Pruitt said. "It's January now." Constance's needle paused. "Well, she's a proud woman, Eleanor Ashford. Doesn't take kindly to charity, from what I understand. I did offer, you'll recall, to have the society organize a proper collection for her last spring, and she declined it outright. Said she was managing fine on her own." "What else was she going to say?" asked young Mrs. Dutton, newer to the society and not yet worn smooth by 11 years of Constance's particular management. Nobody likes admitting they can't manage. Doesn't mean she doesn't need help. Constance's mouth thinned, the particular expression she wore when a meeting threatened to drift somewhere she hadn't planned for it to go. I'm sure if Eleanor truly needed assistance, she said, she'd come and ask for it plainly, same as anyone else in this town has always done. It was Pastor Ames, new to Cedar Fork not 4 months, and still finding his footing among the town's established currents, who spoke up from where he'd been quietly repairing a broken chair leg in the corner, a task he'd taken on himself rather than interrupt the ladies' meeting. Forgive me, he said, straightening, but I visited the Ashford homestead myself last week, taking the long way back from a call at the Peterson place. There's precious little there that speaks of a woman managing fine. A roof in need of mending. A woodpile that would have been bare as bone if not for whoever's been quietly restocking it. 2 children who looked thinner than children ought to look, this deep into winter. The room went quiet. Mrs. Dutton's visit came on a Thursday afternoon, unannounced, which Eleanor would later admit to herself was probably the only way it could have happened at all, since she'd have found some polite reason to decline it otherwise. She found Eleanor in the yard, splitting kindling with a determination that spoke of a task she'd rather not have been doing alone, her breath coming in short white clouds, her hands red with cold despite the mittens. Mrs. Dutton, Eleanor said, straightening, wiping a strand of hair back with the back of her wrist. This is unexpected. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, Mrs. Dutton said, climbing down from her buggy with a covered basket in hand. I was passing this way and thought I'd stop. It was, they both understood without saying so, not remotely on the way to anywhere Mrs. Dutton had legitimate business, but Eleanor found she didn't have the heart to point that out. Not with the woman standing there looking genuinely uncertain of her welcome, a basket held out like an offering she wasn't sure would be accepted. I've brought bread, Mrs. Dutton said, and some preserves. It isn't charity, she added quickly, seeing something shift in Eleanor's face. It's what neighbors do for each other. I should have come sooner. I'm sorry I didn't. Eleanor stood a moment with the axe still in her hand, feeling the old familiar instinct rise up in her. The polite refusal, the insistence that she was managing just fine. Thank you. The pride that had gotten her through 3 hard winters largely on the strength of never once admitting how close to the edge she truly was. But Mary had come to the doorway at the sound of the buggy, and Sam was peering around her skirts, and something in their faces, a wariness that had no business being on children so young, made Eleanor set the axe down instead. Thank you, she said, and the words cost her more than Mrs. Dutton likely understood. Won't you come in out of the cold? The house was small and neat despite everything. Eleanor's pride evident in every carefully mended curtain and swept floor, though Mrs. Dutton noticed, without meaning to, the thinness of the stew simmering on the stove, meant to stretch further than a pot that size ought reasonably to stretch. They talked for the better part of an hour, about nothing in particular at first, the hard winter, the price of feed, Mary's schoolwork, which Eleanor spoke of with a pride that lit her whole face in a way Mrs. Dutton hadn't expected. It was easy, once the ice had properly broken, to see past the careful pride to the woman underneath it. Tired, yes, and proud past all good sense, but capable and warm and clearly loving these 2 children with everything she had left to give. I'll come again, Mrs. Dutton said, gathering her shawl as the afternoon light began to fade. If you'll have me. I'd like that, Eleanor said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. She stood in the yard a long while after the buggy had gone, watching the dust settle on the road, feeling something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 3 years ease, just slightly, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember. That night, when the wood appeared at her gate again, silent as always, she found herself standing at the window a long moment, watching the dark shape of a wagon disappear down the frosted road, and thought, not for the first time, that Cedar Fork might hold more kindness in it than she'd let herself believe. The schoolhouse recital fell on a bitter Friday evening in February, the kind of cold that made the walk from the wagon to the door feel considerably longer than it was, and Eleanor arrived with both children scrubbed and pressed into their best clothes. Mary clutching a hand-copied poem she'd been rehearsing for a week. The schoolhouse was warm and crowded, families packed onto narrow benches, lanterns glowing against the frosted windows, and Eleanor found a spot near the back, out of long habit, where she could slip away easily if the evening proved harder than she'd bargained for. She saw Nate Reeves before Mary's recitation began, seated near the front with Gus Ferris beside him, and felt something small and unexpected catch in her chest at the sight of him. A man she'd exchanged perhaps 24 words with over 3 years, and yet, watching him now, she found herself wondering, with an intensity that startled her, whether it was truly his wagon she'd been hearing at her gate all this time. Mary's poem came third, a piece about springtime that she delivered with more confidence than Eleanor had dared hope for, and Eleanor watched her daughter's small, proud face and felt her own eyes go unexpectedly wet, thinking of all the recitals over 3 years that Mary had stood through without a father in the audience, thinking of how fiercely her daughter had learned to hold her chin up regardless. When the program ended and the benches scraped back for the social hour after, coffee and cake laid out on trestle tables at the room's edge, Eleanor found herself, quite without planning it, standing near enough to Nate Reeves that avoiding conversation would have required an obviousness she wasn't willing to risk. "Fine recitation your daughter gave," Nate said, his voice quieter and rougher than she remembered, a man clearly more accustomed to cattle than to crowded rooms. "Thank you. She's been practicing all week." Eleanor hesitated, then found herself asking, before good sense could stop her, "Mr. Reeves, may I ask you something plainly?" Something in his face went carefully still. "Of course. Have you been the one leaving wood at my gate?" These 2 winters passed. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Eleanor thought, for a moment, she'd overstepped badly, misjudged the whole situation, and embarrassed them both in the middle of a crowded schoolhouse. Then Nate looked down at his coffee cup, turning it once in his hands, and said, quiet enough that it wasn't for the room, "It has been." "Why?" she asked, and it wasn't accusation in her voice, only genuine bewilderment, 3 years of careful pride making the question harder to ask than it ought to have been. Nate was quiet a moment longer, and when he answered, his voice had gone rougher still, carrying something old and unhealed in it. "I know what a thin fire feels like," he said. "Lost my wife 4 years back. Got through that first winter cold and proud and mostly alone, because I couldn't bring myself to ask for help and nobody thought to offer it without being asked. I didn't want you going through the same, if I could help it. Didn't see the need to make a show of it." Eleanor stood there, coffee cup forgotten in her hand, feeling something shift and settle in her chest. 3 years of unanswered gratitude finally finding somewhere to land. "I don't know how to thank you properly," she said. "You don't need to," he said. "Wasn't done for thanks." "I know," she said. "That's rather the trouble. It makes it harder to know what to do with it." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved at the corner of his mouth, brief and unpracticed, like a man testing whether the expression still fit him. "You don't have to do anything with it, Mrs. Ashford," he said. "Just let an old widower do a decent thing for a neighbor, without making more of it than it is." Eleanor looked at him a long moment, at the careful guardedness in his face that she recognized, because she wore the very same expression most days herself, and found herself wondering whether it was truly so simple as he made it sound. "I don't think I quite believe you, Mr. Reeves," she said softly, "but I'm grateful all the same." He didn't argue the point. He only nodded, once, and the 2 of them stood together a moment longer in the warm, crowded room, saying nothing further, while around them the town of Cedar Fork went on with its coffee and its cake, entirely unaware that something quiet and significant had just shifted between 2 of its most careful, guarded people. Spring came slow to Cedar Fork that year, mud season stretching longer than anyone had patience for, and it was during this in-between weather, neither properly winter nor properly spring, that Nate found himself riding past the Ashford place with rather less reason than usual. He told himself, the first time, that he was only checking whether the recent rains had washed out the low crossing near her property line. He told himself, the second time, that Gus had asked after her fence line, which wasn't entirely a lie, since Gus had indeed mentioned it, though not with any urgency requiring a personal inspection. By the third time, he'd stopped bothering with excuses, at least to himself, and simply admitted that he wanted to see her. She was in the garden when he rode up that third time, turning over the season's first soil with a hoe, Mary and Sam both nearby with smaller tools of their own. The whole scene lit gold with late afternoon sun, and something in Nate's chest went tight and warm at once, watching her work. "Mr. Reeves," she said, straightening, wiping her hands on her apron. "Twice in 1 week. Should I be concerned for the state of my fences?" "Fences are fine," he admitted, climbing down from his horse. "Truth is, I hadn't much reason to come by at all, except that I wanted to." He said it plainly, without the careful hedging he'd have used a month before, and watched something soften in Eleanor's face at the honesty of it. "Well," she said, "you're welcome all the same, reason or none. Sam's been wanting someone to show him the proper way to plant potato eyes. His father never got the chance to teach him much of anything on that score." It was the first time she'd mentioned her late husband so plainly, so easily, and Nate understood it for the small gift it was, an opening, offered without fanfare, into a part of her life she'd kept carefully guarded until now. He spent the better part of an hour showing Sam how to cut and space the potato eyes, the boy's small face fierce with concentration, Mary trailing after them both with the particular bossy helpfulness of an older sister determined not to be left out. Eleanor watched from the garden's edge and found herself, without quite meaning to, memorizing the sight of it. A man patient with her son in a way she hadn't realized she'd been missing until she saw it happening. Afterward, she brought out coffee, and they sat together on the porch steps while the children chased each other around the yard in the last of the daylight, and the conversation, easier now than it had been in the schoolhouse, wandered somewhere neither of them had quite planned for it to go. "I said something to my wife 2 mornings before she died," Nate said, watching the children rather than Eleanor, "that I've never forgiven myself for. Nothing terrible, just tired and short, over some small thing I can't even properly remember now. I never got the chance to take it back. I think about it most days still." Eleanor was quiet a moment, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands. "My husband had been drinking that morning," she said finally, her voice careful and low. "I begged him not to ride out with the herd until he'd slept it off. He went anyway. I've spent 3 years wondering if I'd begged harder, made more of a scene, whether he'd still be here." Nate looked at her then, at the old guilt sitting plain and unhealed on her face, and understood, with a clarity that struck him hard, that they were carrying nearly identical weights, each of them certain, in their own private way, that they might have changed what couldn't be changed if only they'd said or done one thing differently. "Neither of us could have stopped what happened," he said quietly. "I've told myself that 1,000 times and only half believed it. Maybe it's easier to believe, hearing it about someone else's grief instead of my own." "Maybe it is," Eleanor agreed softly. They sat together a while longer as the light faded gold to blue, saying little else, and Nate found, riding home in the deepening dusk, that something in his chest felt lighter than it had in 4 long years, as though speaking his old regret aloud, to someone who understood exactly its particular weight, had finally let some of it go. Constance Whitfield heard about the potato planting from 3 separate sources before the week was out, each telling growing more embellished than the last, until by Sunday the story circulating after church suggested Nate Reeves had all but moved into the Ashford homestead. She found the actual truth considerably less dramatic than the gossip, but no less worth commenting on, which she did, cornering Eleanor after the service with the particular smiling firmness she reserved for matters she considered her business whether or not anyone else agreed. "I hear Nathaniel Reeves has been spending a good deal of time at your place, Eleanor," she said, her tone pleasant enough that the words beneath it took a moment to land properly. "He's been kind to my children," Eleanor said carefully. "Taught Sam to plant potatoes. That's the whole of it." Constance's smile didn't waver, but something behind her eyes sharpened. Of course. Only I'd hate for talk to start, dear, given your circumstances. A widow, alone, entertaining a widower so regularly. People do talk, in a town this size. People have talked about me for 3 years regardless of what I actually do, Eleanor said, and was faintly surprised at how steady her own voice came out. I expect they'll go on doing so whether Mr. Reeves visits or not. That's not quite fair, Constance said, a note of genuine surprise in her voice, as though the accusation hadn't occurred to her before. This town has always wished you well. This town sent 1 casserole in 3 years, Eleanor said, quiet but unflinching, and left me and my children to manage a winter on what I didn't know until recently who'd been providing. I don't say that with bitterness, Constance. I say it because I think you believe your own good intentions rather more than the evidence supports. Constance's mouth opened, then closed again, some unfamiliar mixture of offense and genuine reflection working across her features. I'll think on that, she said finally, stiffly, and turned to go, though she paused after a few steps and looked back, something almost sincere in her expression now. For what it's worth, Eleanor, I don't believe I ever meant unkindness. I believe I simply stopped looking, the way people do, once the immediate shock of a loss passes and the world moves on to its next concern. That's a poor excuse, but it's an honest one. She left before Eleanor could respond, and Eleanor stood a long moment in the churchyard, oddly unsettled by the exchange, unsure whether she'd won an argument or simply witnessed a woman beginning, however reluctantly, to see something she'd avoided seeing for years. Nate found her there a few minutes later, having watched the exchange from a polite distance, unable to hear the words but reading enough in both women's postures to guess at the substance. Everything all right, he asked. Eleanor considered the question a moment before answering honestly. I believe so. I think I just told Constance Whitfield something she needed to hear, whether she wanted to or not. Nate's mouth curved, something like admiration plain in his face. I imagine that took some doing. Less than I'd have guessed, Eleanor admitted. 3 years of silence built up more courage than I realized. They walked toward the wagons together, the children trailing ahead, and neither of them noticed, or much cared, the handful of curious glances following them across the churchyard. Proof, if proof were needed, that whatever Constance's warning had intended, it had done little to slow whatever was quietly, steadily growing between them. The fever came on Sam without warning, the way such things often did. A Tuesday morning that started ordinary enough and turned, by mid-afternoon, into something that had Eleanor's hands shaking as she pressed a cool cloth to her son's burning forehead. He'd complained of a sore throat at breakfast, nothing more, and by 2 o'clock he was flushed and listless, his small body radiating heat that frightened her in a way she hadn't been frightened in 3 years. Not since the morning they brought her husband's body home from the drive. Mary, watch him, she said, already reaching for her shawl, voice tight and controlled in the way she'd learned to manage fear. I'm going for Doc Marsh. But the nearest neighbor with a horse fast enough to spare time was the Reeves Ranch, a mile off across muddy spring roads that would slow her own aging mare considerably, and Eleanor found herself, without fully deciding to, riding first toward Nate's place instead of straight to town, some instinct she didn't examine too closely telling her he was the surer, faster help. He was in the yard when she arrived, and one look at her face had him moving before she'd finished explaining, saddling his fastest horse while Gus, appearing from the barn, offered to ride to town for the doctor himself, faster than Eleanor's mare could manage. Go on back to your boy, Nate said, already mounting. I'll bring the doc myself, quicker this way. Gus, get word to Doc Marsh we're heading her way regardless, case she's not at the office. Eleanor rode back to her homestead with her heart hammering, and found Mary sitting white-faced beside Sam's bed, pressing a cloth to his forehead with the careful seriousness of a child trying desperately to be helpful in a situation entirely beyond her control. He said his head hurt something awful, Mary said, voice small. Is he going to be all right, Mama? I don't know yet, sweetheart, Eleanor said, because she had promised herself, since her husband's death, never to lie to her children about anything that mattered. But we're getting him help. Doctor's coming. The wait that followed felt endless. Eleanor alternating between the window and Sam's bedside, her son's small body trembling now with chills despite the heat radiating off his skin, muttering things that didn't quite make sense, and Eleanor found herself praying in a way she hadn't allowed herself since the funeral. 3 years of careful, guarded faith cracking open all at once under the weight of a fear too large to carry alone. Nate arrived first, Doc Marsh close behind him in her own buggy, and the doctor moved through the small house with brisk, efficient calm, examining Sam with careful hands while Eleanor hovered, unable to make herself sit still. Scarlet fever, Doc Marsh said finally, her voice steady but grave. Caught early enough, I believe, but he'll need close watching the next several days. Fever like this can turn dangerous quick if it's not managed careful. Eleanor felt her knees go weak, and it was Nate's hand, steady at her elbow, that kept her upright. The same quiet steadiness he'd shown at her gate for 2 winters now, finally standing beside her in the daylight instead of vanishing into the dark. I'm not leaving, he said, low enough that only she could hear it. Not tonight. Not till we know he's past the worst of it. Eleanor looked at him, at the plain, unshakable certainty in his face, and found she didn't have the pride left in her, not tonight, to send him away. Thank you, she said, and let herself, for the first time in 3 long years, lean into help freely offered instead of bracing against it. Sam's fever broke on the 3rd night, somewhere past midnight, and Eleanor woke from the shallow doze she'd fallen into beside his bed to find his forehead cool under her palm for the first time in 3 days, his breathing easy and even. She sat very still a long moment, afraid to trust it, afraid the relief flooding through her was premature, until Doc Marsh, who'd stayed the better part of those 3 days between her other rounds, confirmed it in the morning with a tired, satisfied smile. He'll mend now, she said. Slow but sure. You did right, getting him help quick as you did. Eleanor had barely slept in 3 days, and it showed in the hollows under her eyes, in the way her hands trembled slightly when she poured coffee that morning. But something in her chest had eased that hadn't eased in years. Not just relief for Sam, though that was the largest part of it, but something else, quieter, having to do with the man who'd barely left the house in 3 days either, sleeping in short snatches on a hard kitchen chair, riding for supplies and fresh water and anything else needed without once being asked twice. She found Nate in the yard that morning, feeding the horses, moving slower than usual with exhaustion plain in every line of him, and something in her chest went soft and full at the sight. You should go home and sleep in a proper bed, she said. You've done more than enough. More than I had any right to ask. You didn't ask, he said, not looking up from the feed bucket. I stayed because I wanted to be here. There's a difference. Eleanor stood a moment, watching him work, and found the words she'd been holding back for 3 days finally rising up with nowhere left to hide. I don't know how to be the kind of woman who lets herself need someone, she said quietly. I've spent 3 years proving I don't, to myself as much as to this town. And then Sam took sick, and the very first thing I did, without even deciding to, was ride toward you instead of toward town. I don't know what to make of that. Nate set the feed bucket down slowly and turned to face her, exhaustion and something far gentler both plain in his weathered face. Maybe it means some part of you already knows what the rest of you hasn't caught up to admitting yet, he said. And what's that? She asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. That you don't have to carry everything alone anymore, he said, quiet and certain. Not if you don't want to. I've been riding past your gate 2 winters now telling myself it was only neighborly kindness. I don't believe that anymore, Eleanor. Haven't believed it in some while now, if I'm honest. Eleanor felt her breath catch, the yard around them gone very still and quiet. Only the horses shifting in their stalls, only Mary's small figure visible through the kitchen window, dozing in a chair beside her brother's bed. What are you saying, Nate? She asked softly, though she already knew, and wanted, badly, to hear him say it plainly. I'm saying I've loved you a good while now, he said, the words coming out rough but steady, a man laying down a weight he'd carried carefully and long. Been afraid to say so, on account of what it might cost, if you didn't feel the same, or weren't ready, or thought it disrespected the grief we're both still carrying. But watching you these 3 days, watching how hard you fight for what you love, I don't want to spend one more winter pretending firewood is the whole of what I have to offer you. Eleanor stood very still, 3 years of careful pride and guarded grief rising up in her all at once, and found, beneath all of it, something simpler and truer waiting to be spoken. I think, she said slowly, I've known it was you at that gate for longer than I let myself admit. And I think some part of me has been waiting, this whole time, for you to say exactly what you just said. Nate crossed the yard to her then, slow and careful, giving her every chance to step back if she wanted to. And when she didn't, when she stood her ground and let him close the distance between them, he took her hand, gentle as anything, and held it there in the cool spring morning, the horses shifting quiet in their stalls, the whole wide sky opening up blue and endless above them both. News of Sam's illness had traveled through Cedar Fork the way such news always did, and by the time the boy was well enough to sit up and take broth, half the town had heard some version of how Nathaniel Reeves had stayed 3 days at the widow Ashford's homestead, nursing her sick child alongside her. The gossip that followed was not entirely unkind, though it carried its share of raised eyebrows and knowing looks, and it reached Constance Whitfield in a form considerably more scandalous than the truth actually warranted. She arrived at the Ashford homestead on a Saturday afternoon, ostensibly to inquire after Sam's recovery, though Eleanor suspected, correctly, that curiosity about Nate Reeves's continued presence played rather more of a role in the visit than concern for her son's health. She found them together in the yard, Sam bundled in a chair in the weak spring sun, still pale but improving. Nate crouched beside him, showing him something in a wooden box that turned out, on closer inspection, to be a set of small carved animals he'd whittled himself over the 3 long nights of watching. Mrs. Whitfield, Eleanor said, straightening from where she'd been tucking a blanket around Sam's legs. This is a surprise. I heard your boy had taken ill, Constance said, her eyes moving between Eleanor and Nate with an expression that suggested she was doing careful mental arithmetic. I wanted to see for myself that he was recovering. He is, thank you. Doc Marsh says he'll be right as rain within the week. Constance's gaze settled on Nate, still crouched beside Sam's chair, the boy laughing now at some small joke Nate had made about one of the wooden animals. I understand Mr. Reeves has been rather a fixture here these past days, she said, careful and probing. He has, Eleanor said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she felt no instinct to explain or apologize for it. He stayed to help nurse my son through a dangerous fever. I don't know how I'd have managed those 3 days without him, if I'm honest, and I don't intend to pretend otherwise for the sake of appearances. Constance's mouth opened, likely to offer some further careful warning about propriety in talk, but something in Eleanor's plain, unflinching honesty seemed to catch her off guard, and she found herself, instead, looking properly at the scene in front of her. A recovering child laughing over a whittled wooden horse, a weathered rancher's face soft with a tenderness Constance had rarely seen him show anyone, a widow standing steady and unashamed beside them both. I see, Constance said slowly, and something in her tone had shifted, some old certainty giving quiet ground to a truth she hadn't expected to encounter so plainly. She stayed longer than she'd intended, that afternoon, and left with considerably less to gossip about than she'd arrived hoping to gather, though she found herself thinking, on the ride home, about Pastor Ames's words from that January meeting, about mistaking a woman's pride for permission to stop looking closely, with an honesty she hadn't allowed herself in some while. By the time she reached her own gate, Constance Whitfield had made a decision she'd have found unthinkable a month before, and the following Tuesday, at the Ladies' Aid Society meeting, she stood before the assembled group and proposed, with a humility that startled everyone present, that the society organize a proper, ongoing effort to check on the widows and struggling families of Cedar Fork, not with casseroles offered once and forgotten, but with real, sustained attention. I have been guilty, she said, of believing good intentions were the same as good actions. I don't intend to make that mistake again. Nobody quite knew what to say to that at first. But by the meeting's end, a list had been drawn up, and Eleanor Ashford's name, for the first time in 3 years, appeared on it not as a name to be quietly pitied from a distance, but as a neighbor the whole town had finally agreed to properly see. Spring deepened into early summer across Cedar Fork, the cedars along the river bend going full and green, and with the changing season came a changing rhythm to Nate's visits. No longer excuses about fences or Gus's opinions, but plain and open, a man courting a woman the way courting was meant to happen, with Sunday dinners and long evening walks and small thoughtful gifts that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with simple affection. Mary took to him with an ease that surprised Eleanor, the girl's sharp 9-year-old mind having clearly decided, somewhere in the 3 days of Sam's illness, that Nate Reeves belonged in whatever category of person deserved trust, and she began, without any prompting from her mother, asking him questions about ranching and horses and whether he might teach her to ride properly come summer. Sam, fully recovered now and trailing Nate around the yard whenever he visited with the devoted persistence particular to small boys who'd found someone worth admiring, had taken to calling him simply Nate, dropping the Mister entirely within a few weeks, a familiarity Eleanor noticed and said nothing about, because she found, watching it happen, that she didn't want to correct it. It was on one of these ordinary evenings, the children already abed, the two of them sitting together on the porch steps with the last of the daylight fading soft over the pasture, that Nate finally asked the question that had been building in him for weeks. "I've been thinking," he said, turning his hat slowly in his hands, a habit she'd come to recognize as his particular brand of nervousness, "about what comes next. For us, I mean." Eleanor felt her heart quicken, though she kept her voice steady. "And what do you think comes next?" "I think," he said slowly, "I'd like to marry you, Eleanor Ashford. Properly, and soon, if you'll have me. I know it's not been a long courtship by most folks' reckoning, but I've known you 3 years in one fashion or another, even if most of that knowing happened from a distance, in the dark, with a wagon load of firewood between us." Eleanor laughed at that, soft and unguarded, and found her eyes had gone unexpectedly wet. "I'd like that very much," she said. "Though I'll tell you plain, Nate Reeves, I've spent 3 years proving to this town and to myself that I could manage alone. I don't want you thinking you're rescuing me from something I couldn't handle on my own." "I don't think that at all," he said, firm and certain. "I think you're the strongest woman I've ever known, and I'd be a fool to mistake wanting your company for thinking you need saving. I'm not offering to fix anything, Eleanor. I'm offering to build something alongside you, for however many years we've got left to build it." She looked at him a long moment in the fading light, at the plain, unguarded honesty in his weathered face, and found, at last, that she believed him completely. "Then yes," she said, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her there on the porch steps, gentle and sure, the cedars rustling soft in the evening breeze, and somewhere behind them, unseen, Mary watched from her bedroom window with a smile she'd remember for the rest of her life, already composing, in her 9-year-old mind, exactly how she'd tell her brother the news come morning. They were married in June, in the small Cedar Fork church with its windows thrown open to let in the warm summer air, and the wedding, unlike so much of Eleanor's life these past 3 years, was attended by nearly the whole town, filling the pews in a way that would have seemed impossible to imagine even 6 months before. Constance Whitfield sat near the front, and had, in fact, organized the flowers herself, great armfuls of prairie roses and black-eyed Susans that filled the small church with color and scent, a gesture of amends she never spoke of directly, but that Eleanor understood perfectly well for what it was. Doc Marsh sat beside Gus Ferris, who wore, for the occasion, a coat considerably finer than his usual working clothes and dabbed at his eyes more than once during the ceremony, though he'd have denied it fiercely if anyone had mentioned it. Mary stood at her mother's side as the sole attendant, solemn and proud in a new dress Eleanor had stayed up 3 nights sewing, and Sam, seated in the front pew between Constance and Mrs. Dutton, watched the whole proceeding with the rapt seriousness of a boy witnessing something he understood, even at 6, to be important. Pastor Ames spoke briefly before the vows, his voice carrying warm and clear through the open windows. "I have been in Cedar Fork less than a year," he said, "and in that short time, I have watched this town learn something important about the difference between good intentions and good actions. I have watched a community that once mistook a widow's pride for a reason to look away, learn instead to look closer, to see what quiet strength and quiet kindness had been doing all along, mostly unnoticed, mostly unthanked. Today we celebrate not only a marriage, but a town's willingness to be better than its old habits." Eleanor, standing at the altar in a simple dress the color of summer wheat, found her eyes filling as she looked out over the gathered congregation. Faces that had once offered polite distance now offering genuine warmth, a whole town that had, in its own slow, imperfect way, finally learned to see her. Nate took her hands as the vows began, his own eyes suspiciously bright, and spoke his promises in a voice that carried clear and steady through the little church, for years of careful solitude finally giving way to something he'd stopped believing he deserved to have again. "I promise to never again mistake silence for strength," he said, departing slightly from the vows Pastor Ames had written for them, his eyes fixed steady on Eleanor's. "I spent 4 years believing that carrying grief alone was the only way to honor it properly. You've taught me otherwise, Eleanor Ashford. I intend to spend the rest of my life proving I learned the lesson well." Eleanor, when her turn came, found she had her own addition to make. "I promise to let myself be helped," she said, her voice unsteady but clear. "I spent 3 years believing that needing someone made me weak, that accepting kindness confirmed everything this town once believed about me. You showed me that isn't true, Nate Reeves. Not once, in all the nights you left wood at my gate expecting nothing in return. I intend to spend the rest of my life being the kind of wife who never again mistakes your love for pity or my own strength for something that has to stand entirely alone." They kissed to the sound of the whole congregation's warm applause, and outside, as they emerged into the bright June afternoon, the whole town of Cedar Fork gathered on the church lawn for a celebration that would be talked about for years afterward. Not for any scandal or gossip, for once, but simply for the genuine joy of it, a community that had, through one quiet man's steady kindness and one proud woman's slow-earned trust, finally remembered what it meant to truly see its own. Marriage, Eleanor learned within the first month, did not erase 3 years of habits built on managing alone, and there were mornings she caught herself halfway through a task before remembering she no longer had to do it by herself. She stood at the stove one such morning, kneading bread with more force than the dough required, working through some frustration she couldn't quite name, when Nate came in from the morning chores and took one look at her face before crossing the kitchen and taking her flour-dusted hands gently in his own. "Something wrong?" he asked. "I don't rightly know," she admitted, laughing a little at herself despite the tightness in her chest. "I went to fix the hinge on the shed door myself, same as I've done every week for 3 years, and found you'd already mended it. I should be grateful. I think some old stubborn part of me felt almost robbed instead." Nate was quiet a moment, considering that with the same careful attention he gave everything. "I'll ask you first, next time," he said finally, "rather than just fixing what needs fixing. That way it's a choice you're making, not something happening around you." Eleanor felt something in her chest ease at that, grateful in a way that went beyond the hinge itself, for a husband who understood that her pride wasn't something to be dismantled all at once, but something to be honored even while it slowly, gently, learned to loosen its grip. "It won't always be like this," she said. "I don't mean to keep fighting help I've finally agreed to accept." "I don't mind the fighting," he said, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "Man who married a woman with no fight left in her would have married someone considerably less interesting than you, Eleanor Reeves." She laughed properly at that, the tightness in her chest finally easing all the way, and found, over the weeks that followed, that the adjustment came easier than she'd feared. not because her independence vanished, but because Nate seemed to understand, instinctively, that loving her meant making room for it rather than replacing it. The children adjusted faster than either adult, in the particular resilient way of children who'd been quietly hoping for exactly this kind of family long before the grown-ups had worked out how to build it. Sam had taken to following Nate through every chore with unshakable devotion, and Mary, though older and more careful about her affections, had begun, without any fanfare, addressing letters to her grandmother back east with the news that she now had a stepfather who was teaching her to ride, and didn't mind one bit that she asked too many questions. It was Sam, in the end, who marked the real turning point, 3 months into the marriage. On an ordinary evening when he'd fallen from the porch step and scraped his knee badly enough to cry, and reached, without thinking, not for his mother but for Nate, who was closer, calling out the word that changed something quietly and permanently in the small kitchen. "Pa," he sobbed, holding his knee. "It hurts." Nate scooped him up without hesitation, and Eleanor, watching from the doorway, felt her whole chest go warm and full and unsteady all at once. Watching her son cling to a man who had, in the space of a few short months, become exactly what that single unplanned word declared him to be. Later, once Sam was cleaned up and settled with a cookie to ease the last of his tears, Nate found Eleanor still standing quiet in the kitchen doorway and reached for her hand. "Didn't put that word in his mouth," he said softly. "Wanted you to know that." "I know," she said, her voice thick. "He gave it to you himself. That means more than if you'd asked for it." They stood together in the warm kitchen light, listening to Sam's laughter drift in from the front room where Mary had joined him with some game or other, and Eleanor thought, not for the first time since the wedding, that the family she'd feared she'd never rebuild had, quietly, and without her quite noticing the exact moment, become whole again. The drought announced itself slowly that summer, the way such things always did, a dry spring giving way to a drier June, the river along the Cedar Bend running lower than old-timers could remember seeing it in a decade. By July, the grass on Nate's grazing land had begun to brown early, and the worry that had settled over Cedar Fork's ranching families showed plainly in the tight faces at church and the low, urgent conversations outside the feed mill. Eleanor watched Nate ride the fence lines longer each day, watched the careful arithmetic working behind his eyes each evening as he studied the sky for rain clouds that refused to gather, and recognized, with an ache of familiar dread, the particular strain of a man watching his livelihood slip away by degrees he couldn't control. "We'll manage," he said one evening, though his voice carried less certainty than the words themselves. "Will we?" Eleanor asked, not unkindly, only honestly. "I've been through a hard year before, Nate. I know what it looks like when a person says we'll manage because saying anything else feels too dangerous to risk aloud." He didn't answer right away, and when he did, his voice had dropped its careful bravado. "Truth is, I don't know," he admitted. "If this drought holds through August, I'll likely have to sell off a portion of the herd early, take a loss on cattle that aren't fattened proper. It's not ruin, but it's not nothing, either." Eleanor sat with that a long moment, feeling old fears rise up, the particular terror of watching a family's security erode slowly, the same helpless dread she'd carried through her husband's death and the hard years after. But this time, she noticed, the fear didn't sit alone in her chest the way it once had. This time, it sat beside a steadiness that came from not carrying it by herself. "Then we'll figure it together," she said, firm and certain. "Whatever needs doing. Selling stock, taking in extra mending work, whatever it takes to see us through. I managed 3 years alone on considerably less than what we've got together now. I expect we can manage this too." Something in Nate's face eased, hearing that, a weight visibly shifting off shoulders that had been carrying it entirely alone out of some old habit he was still learning to break. "I keep forgetting," he said quietly, "that I don't have to solve everything myself anymore either." "Seems we're both still learning that lesson," Eleanor said, reaching for his hand. They rode out the drought together over the difficult weeks that followed, Eleanor's garden producing enough, through careful rationing and canning, to offset some of the strain, Gus Ferris working extra hours without complaint, and Constance Whitfield, in a gesture that would have seemed impossible a year before, organizing the Ladies' Aid Society into a proper relief effort for every struggling ranch family in the valley, coordinating shared wells and traded feed stores with an efficiency that surprised everyone, herself included. It was hard, and it cost them. Nate did sell off a portion of the herd in August, at a loss he felt keenly, and there were tight weeks where the household budget stretched thin as it had in Eleanor's hardest widow years. But it was, Eleanor found, an entirely different kind of hard than she'd known before, a hardship shared and shouldered together, and she discovered, moving through those difficult weeks beside a husband who never once made her feel the burden was hers alone to carry, that shared hardship had a way of deepening love rather than eroding it. The rains finally came in September, breaking the drought in a hard, welcome storm that had the whole valley's ranchers standing out in their yards letting it soak them through, laughing with relief. And Eleanor stood on her own porch that evening watching Nate do exactly that, arms spread wide to the falling rain, and felt something in her chest settle deep and permanent. The certainty, hard won and fully earned, that whatever difficulties still lay ahead, she would never again have to face them entirely alone. Autumn brought its own quiet reckoning, in the form of a letter that arrived at the Ashford, now Reeves, homestead from Eleanor's late husband's family back in Ohio, a family that had gone silent 3 years before, unanswering every letter Eleanor had sent about the children, about the funeral, about anything at all. The letter, when Eleanor opened it with hands that trembled slightly, proved to be from her late husband's mother, an elderly woman named Prudence Ashford whom Eleanor had met only twice, at her own wedding and at the funeral 3 years later, and whose silence in the years between had felt, to Eleanor, like one more confirmation that she and the children had been left entirely alone in the world. The letter was brief and careful, and carried an apology Eleanor had stopped expecting to ever receive. "I have been a poor correspondent these 3 years," Prudence had written, "and I owe you more explanation than I have given. The truth is I could not, for a long while, write to you without my grief for my son overwhelming every word, and rather than write badly, I chose not to write at all, which I understand now was its own kind of cruelty, leaving you and my grandchildren without word from the only family my son left behind. I have heard, through a cousin's letter, that you have remarried, and that my grandchildren are well and thriving. I find I am glad of it, more than I expected to be. I would like, if you would permit it, to know my grandchildren properly, through letters at first, and perhaps, in time, a visit. I understand if you feel I have forfeited that right through my long silence. I hope, all the same, that you might find room for an old woman's late attempt at doing better." Eleanor read the letter twice, sitting at her kitchen table with the autumn light slanting gold through the window, feeling old grief and old anger and a cautious, unexpected hope all moving through her chest at once. She showed it to Nate that evening, and he read it carefully, then looked up at her with the same steady attention he gave every difficult thing in her life. "What do you want to do?" he asked, not offering an opinion first, the way he'd learned, over these months of marriage, that she needed the chance to work through her own feelings before hearing his. "I think," Eleanor said slowly, "I want to write back. Mary and Sam deserve to know their father's family, even if it comes later than it should have. And I think," she paused, considering the truth of it as she spoke, "I think I understand, better than I once did, what it means to let grief keep a person silent longer than it should. I've done my own version of that these 3 years, in my own way." Nate reached across the table and took her hand. "Seems to me," he said, "this town spent the whole of this year learning that lesson, one way or another. Constance included. Might be Prudence Ashford's simply the latest to work it out for herself." Eleanor wrote back that same evening, a careful letter that extended the invitation Prudence had asked for without pretending the 3 years of silence hadn't hurt. And within a month, a steady correspondence had begun that would, by the following spring, bring Prudence Ashford herself out to Cedar Fork for a visit that mended, slowly and imperfectly, a family bond that grief had nearly severed for good. Mary, who remembered her grandmother only vaguely, took to the correspondence with delight, filling her letters with careful, detailed accounts of school and horses and her new stepfather. And Eleanor found, watching her daughter's growing bond with a grandmother she'd nearly lost, one more piece of quiet evidence that the family broken by loss 3 years before was, slowly and steadily, being rebuilt into something whole. The first frost came early that year, dusting the cedar branches white on an October morning that had Eleanor pulling extra quilts from the cedar chest and Nate splitting kindling with the brisk efficiency of a man who no longer had to ration every log against an uncertain winter. It was Gus Ferris, of all people, who brought the news that finally closed the last open thread of that difficult year, arriving at the ranch one morning with a letter in hand and an expression that suggested he'd been turning something over in his mind for some while. "Been meaning to give you this a good while now," he said, holding the letter out to Nate. "Found it going through some old things after your Catherine passed. Never rightly knew how to give it to you, given the circumstances. And then enough time went by that giving it seemed like it'd only reopen a wound. But watching you and Eleanor this year, I got to thinking maybe it's time." Nate took the letter with visibly unsteady hands, recognizing his late wife's careful handwriting on the envelope, and Eleanor, watching from the porch, felt her chest tighten with a complicated mixture of concern and understanding. He read it alone, out by the fence line where he did most of his difficult thinking, and Eleanor gave him the space to do so, though she watched from a distance, ready to go to him the moment he needed her. He came back to the house an hour later, eyes red-rimmed, but his face carrying something that looked, to Eleanor's relief, more like peace than fresh grief. "It was written the week before she died," he said, sitting heavily at the kitchen table. "Catherine knew she was poorly, near the end, sicker than the doctor let on, I think, or sicker than I let myself believe. She wrote this meaning to give it to me herself, once she was well again. Only she never got well again, and I expect it got put away in the confusion after, and forgotten." "What did she say?" Eleanor asked gently, sitting beside him. "She forgave me," he said, voice rough. "For every sharp word, every tired moment, every small unkindness a marriage collects over years without either person meaning real harm by it. Said she loved me completely, whole and entire, faults included, and that she hoped, if anything happened to her, that I wouldn't spend my life punishing myself for being an ordinary imperfect man who loved her the best way he knew how." Eleanor felt her own eyes fill, understanding immediately the weight of what 4 years of silent, unspoken guilt had just been lifted from. "She knew you, Nate," she said softly. "Knew exactly the kind of man you are. I don't imagine she'd have wanted you carrying that unfinished sentence for 4 long years, punishing yourself for something she'd already forgiven before you ever had the chance to ask." Nate sat with the letter a long moment, tracing his late wife's handwriting with careful fingers, and Eleanor understood, watching him, that she was witnessing something private and important, not jealousy at a love that had come before her own, but a quiet gratitude that the man she'd married was finally, fully, laying down a grief he'd carried far longer than he needed to. "I loved her," he said finally, looking up at Eleanor with something clear and unguarded in his face. "I'll always have loved her. That doesn't take anything away from what I feel for you. If anything, I think loving you has taught me how to finally grieve her properly, instead of just carrying the guilt around like it was the same thing as love." Eleanor took his hand, understanding completely, because she had learned, this past year, the very same lesson about her own grief. That loving again didn't erase what came before, but rather gave a person, at last, the safety to finally let old grief rest instead of guarding it forever like an open wound. Winter settled over Cedar Fork again, gentler this year than the last had been, with Eleanor's woodpile stacked full and proper from the season's first cold snap, no longer a mystery needing solving in the dark. It was Constance Whitfield who organized the Christmas social that year, the first such gathering the Ladies' Aid Society had properly hosted in years, and she did so with a thoroughness that suggested a woman determined to make up, in whatever small way she could, for years of good intentions that had never quite become good actions. The church hall was strung with greenery and candlelight, tables laid with more food than any single gathering required, and every family in Cedar Fork attended, including several Constance had, in years past, considered rather beneath the society's usual concern. Eleanor stood near the refreshment table with Mrs. Dutton, watching Mary and Sam chase each other through the crowd with a handful of other children, Sam's laughter carrying bright and unguarded through the warm room, and felt a fullness in her chest that would have seemed impossible to imagine 2 years before. "You look happy," Mrs. Dutton observed, smiling. "I am," Eleanor said simply, and found the word carried none of the careful hedging she'd have needed a year ago. Constance approached partway through the evening, holding 2 cups of mulled cider, and offered one to Eleanor with an expression that had softened considerably over the year's passage. "I wanted to say something to you," Constance said, a bit stiffly, though her sincerity was plain. "I've thought a good deal, this year, about the kind of woman I want to be remembered as. I don't believe I was cruel to you, Eleanor, not intentionally. But I believe I was comfortable, and comfort has a way of looking a great deal like cruelty to the person left standing outside it." Eleanor considered that a moment, then found she had no wish to hold on to old grievances that had already, in their own slow way, been mended. "I think most people are more comfortable than cruel," she said, "and I think this year has taught this whole town something about the difference. I'd rather remember that than hold on to what came before it." Constance's eyes went unexpectedly bright at that, and she reached out, an uncharacteristic gesture from a woman not given to easy displays of feeling, and squeezed Eleanor's hand. "Thank you," she said, "for that grace. I don't know that I deserve it, but I'm grateful for it all the same." Across the room, Nate stood with Gus and Pastor Ames, deep in some conversation that had Gus laughing loud enough to draw curious glances, and Eleanor watched her husband a long moment, struck, as she often was these days, by how thoroughly he'd settled into a life he'd once believed grief had permanently closed off to him. He caught her eye across the crowded room and made his way over, slipping an arm around her waist with the easy familiarity of a year's worth of marriage. "You look like a woman thinking something important," he said. "I'm thinking," Eleanor said, "that a year ago tonight, I was alone in a cold house worrying whether the wood would last the week, and now I'm standing in a warm room full of people who actually see me, married to a man who taught me that needing help isn't the same as being weak." Nate pressed a kiss to her temple, gentle and warm. "Best year of my life, too," he said quietly, "and I intend to spend every one after it proving that firewood was only ever the beginning." They stood together a while longer, watching their children laugh and play among neighbors who had, over one long difficult year, finally learned to truly see the family standing in their midst, and Eleanor thought, not for the first time, that some of the hardest years of a person's life had a way of becoming, eventually, the foundation for the very best ones. Spring returned to Cedar Fork the following year with none of the anxious uncertainty of the drought before it. The cedars along the river bend budding green and full, the fields Nate had worried over now promising a good season's growth. It was during this easier spring that Eleanor found herself, one ordinary morning, sitting on the porch steps with a strange, unfamiliar wave of nausea passing through her, and Nate, coming in from the morning chores, took one look at her face and crossed the yard with sudden concern. "You're pale as milk," he said. "Something wrong?" Eleanor sat with the question a moment, doing careful arithmetic of her own, and felt a slow, disbelieving smile spread across her face. "I don't think anything's wrong," she said. "I think, Nate Reeves, we might be expecting." The joy that moved across his face in that moment was unlike anything Eleanor had seen from him before. Not the careful, guarded happiness he'd shown even at their wedding, but something entirely unguarded, a man allowing himself, fully and without reservation, to hope for a future he'd once believed grief had closed to him permanently. Doc Marsh confirmed it within the week, and the news, once shared, moved through the family with a warmth that surprised even Eleanor in its intensity. Mary, 12 now and increasingly thoughtful, took to the news with a maturity that had her immediately calculating how she might help with a new baby come winter. Sam, 7 and considerably less patient, wanted to know immediately whether the baby would be a brother he could teach to ride, and was faintly disappointed to learn the timeline didn't allow for quite that level of immediate usefulness. Nate took to spending his evenings, once the day's ranch work was done, carefully building a cradle in the barn workshop, working the wood with the same careful attention he'd once given to stacking firewood at a widow's gate in the dark, and Eleanor found herself, watching him work through the open barn door some evenings, struck again by how thoroughly this quiet, careful man had rebuilt a life he'd once believed was permanently behind him. It was Gus, inevitably, who found the moment to offer his own particular brand of commentary, catching Nate sanding a cradle rail one evening with an expression the old cowhand hadn't seen on his employer in years. "Never thought I'd see the day," Gus said, settling onto an overturned bucket to watch. Men used to ride past a widow's gate at midnight too proud to knock on the door and say a plain word to her face. Now look at you, building cradles and grinning like a fool over it. "Guess I finally learned there's no shame in wanting something," Nate said, not looking up from his work, though his mouth curved with easy humor. "Took me long enough." "Wasn't the wanting that took you so long," Gus said. Was working up the nerve to admit it out loud. "I recall that particular struggle myself, once upon a time, though that's a story for another evening." Nate looked up at that, curious, but Gus only waved the question away with a knowing grin, unwilling, for now, to share whatever old story of his own sat behind the comment. And Nate returned to his sanding with a quiet smile, content, for the moment, simply to build something new for a family he'd once believed was beyond his reach to have again. The baby came in late autumn, a healthy girl born on a crisp October morning with her father's steady dark eyes, and, according to Doc Marsh, a set of lungs that promised she'd grow into a young woman with plenty to say for herself. They named her Catherine Grace, honoring both the wife Nate had lost and the sister Eleanor had once needed the courage to reconcile with over a family secret from long before this story's telling. A small quiet acknowledgement that this new family, whole and thriving now, had been built on the foundation of griefs and reconciliations that deserved remembering rather than forgetting. Mary took to her new baby sister with fierce devotion, appointing herself chief assistant to every feeding and bath, and Sam, though initially disappointed the baby couldn't yet ride a horse, found his own quiet way of claiming her, spending long stretches simply sitting beside her cradle, talking to her about ranch business with the serious confidence of an older brother certain his infant sister was hanging on his every word. Prudence Ashford, Eleanor's late husband's mother, made the long journey out from Ohio for the christening, the correspondence between them having deepened over the intervening year into something genuinely warm, and she stood in the small Cedar Fork church holding her step-grandchild with tears openly running down her weathered face. Grateful, she told Eleanor quietly afterward, for the courage it had taken Eleanor to extend forgiveness to an old woman who'd let grief silence her far too long. Constance Whitfield, present at the christening along with most of the town, brought a hand-stitched quilt for the occasion, worked with careful, patient stitches over months, a gift that carried in its careful craftsmanship an apology considerably more eloquent than any words she might have offered. Nate held his daughter during the ceremony with the particular careful tenderness of a man who understood, better than most, exactly how precious and fragile such happiness could be, having once believed it entirely lost to him. Pastor Ames, performing the christening, spoke briefly of the particular grace found in families built through loss and rebuilding rather than easy fortune, looking out over a congregation that included Eleanor's children from her first marriage, her second husband's memory of his first wife honored in the baby's very name, and a town that had learned, over these past 2 years, what it meant to properly see and support the families within its keeping. "We are shaped," he said, "not only by the love that comes easily, but by the love we choose to rebuild after loss has done its worst to us. This family standing before us today is proof that grief, properly honored rather than avoided, does not close off the possibility of new joy. It makes room for it, if we're brave enough to walk through the difficult, patient work of healing. Eleanor, standing beside Nate with their new daughter between them and her older children close at hand, found herself thinking of that first bitter January night, 3 years past now, when she'd lain awake counting sums that never came out even, certain the town of Cedar Fork had forgotten her entirely. She had been wrong, she understood now, in the way grief sometimes made a person wrong about the shape of their own future. The town hadn't forgotten her. It had simply needed, in its own slow, imperfect way, to be shown how to look properly, and one quiet man's patient kindness, offered in the dark and expecting nothing in return, had been exactly the beginning that made all the rest of it possible. 2 years to the day after that first bitter winter when Eleanor had discovered a mysterious woodpile stacked against her shed, she stood in the same yard, now considerably changed, watching her family gather for an ordinary Sunday dinner that had become, over time, a weekly tradition, drawing in half of Cedar Fork's most important people. Gus Ferris sat at the long table Nate had built specially to accommodate the growing gatherings, teasing Sam, now 8, about some minor ranching mistake with the warm affection of a man who'd become, in every way but blood, another grandfather to the children. Mary, 13 now and increasingly capable, helped Eleanor manage the meal preparations with a competence that made Eleanor's chest ache with pride at the young woman her daughter was becoming. Baby Catherine, walking now on unsteady legs, toddled between the table legs pursued by Mary's careful, watchful attention. Constance Whitfield had become, improbably, one of the family's most regular Sunday guests. Her friendship with Eleanor deepened over 2 years into something neither woman could have predicted that first cold January when Constance had offered careful warnings about propriety instead of genuine help. Pastor Ames came often too, along with Doc Marsh and Mrs. Dutton, the whole gathering a testament to how thoroughly Cedar Fork had learned, through one family's patient example, what genuine neighborliness actually required. Nate found Eleanor in the kitchen doorway, watching the warm chaos of the gathering with an expression of quiet, full contentment, and slipped an arm around her waist the way he'd done 1,000 times these past 2 years, a gesture that had never once lost its comfort. Good crowd, he observed. Good family, Eleanor corrected softly. This town used to feel like something I had to survive alone. Now it feels like something I get to belong to. Nate pressed a kiss to her temple, watching Gus lift Catherine onto his knee amid the table's warm laughter, watching Mary and Sam bicker good-naturedly over the last slice of pie, watching a community that had once been content to leave a struggling widow entirely alone now gathered warm and full around her table. I used to think grief meant you had to choose, he said quietly, between honoring what you lost and letting yourself have something new. Took me 4 years of leaving firewood at your gate before I understood you don't have to choose at all. The love doesn't replace what came before it. It just makes room. Eleanor turned in his arms, looking up at this quiet, steady man who had changed the whole shape of her life one unsigned act of kindness at a time, and found, as she often did these days, that words felt entirely unnecessary to express what she felt. She kissed him instead, soft and certain, while behind them their family's laughter filled the warm kitchen, and outside, the cedars along the river bend stood tall and green against a wide Colorado sky, holding quiet witness to a town and a family that had finally, fully, learned what it meant to truly see the people in its keeping. They did not know, standing there in that ordinary, precious Sunday moment, all the years of joy and difficulty still ahead of them. But they knew, with a certainty hard-won through loss and patience and quiet, persistent kindness, that whatever came next, they would face it exactly as they'd learned to face everything since that first bitter winter, together and unafraid. If stories of quiet kindness, second chances, and families rebuilt from loss speak to your heart, we would be honored to have you join us for the next journey. Thank you for walking this road with Eleanor and Nate, and with the town of Cedar Fork. We will see you next time.